Every day, we're exposed to so much information, from social media to news outlets, from celebrities and influencers, and various so called experts, all claiming to know the truth, all telling us what to think and how to feel. But so much of what is presented is filtered and distorted, inaccurate or incomplete. And so it's more important than ever to think critically. Now, the problem is most of us have never been taught how to think critically. It's not something that most parents teach their children. It's not something that is commonly taught in schools. In fact, most people are conditioned not to think critically. Most people are conditioned to blindly accept whatever they're told on the basis of authority or expertise. But in reality, authorities and experts are not always trustworthy. Established news outlets, for example, have long been considered trusted sources of information, but often they distort the truth by being selective with their facts, omitting crucial information, or by the ways in which they twist the details of a story to give it a certain spin. They don't always outright lie, but by intentionally leaving out certain details or presenting opinions in place of facts, they can create a narrative that misrepresents reality. And when those narratives are driven by profit or political bias, it's not just misinformation, it's manipulation. That's why critical thinking is so essential. To think critically means to pause before you react, to question before you accept, and to verify the information you receive before you go on repeating it. What I'm advocating here is skepticism, which means neither accepting nor rejecting a claim without thorough investigation. And let me just repeat that. Skepticism means neither accepting nor rejecting any given claim without thoroughly investigating. Because blind rejection is just as foolish as blind acceptance. If you dismiss everything out of hand simply because you don't like the source or because it doesn't fit your worldview, you're no closer to truth than the person who believes everything they hear without question. True skepticism is not about outright dismissing anything. It's about asking the question, how can I know if this is true? So what we're looking for is evidence. But here's where things get tricky. Because even the evidence can be misleading. Something you'll often see on social media and even in the news is how a short video clip or a quote can be taken out of context and then used to spin a narrative around it. And what I've learned is that context is very important because what I've often found is that when I see the full context, it doesn't always support the narrative. In fact, sometimes it refutes it. The problem is that most people don't bother to seek out the full context. Most people are content to simply accept the narrative given to them without question. And as a result, most people tend to be grossly misinformed. But what they'll do is point to that little video clip or that quote and say, but here's the evidence. But the thing to understand about evidence is that it's not the same thing as proof. It's just a piece of the puzzle. And evidence can be flawed. It can be fabricated. It can be partial, or it can simply be misinterpreted. But to put it simply, you can find evidence to support just about any claim, no matter how absurd. Take, for example, people who believe the Earth is flat. The reason they believe this is because there's evidence to support that claim, such as the fact that when you look out at the horizon, there's no visible curvature. But those little bits of evidence, taken in isolation without the fuller context, create a false conclusion. What they lack is the broader picture. And this is why context is so important, because without it, even something that looks like evidence can be misleading. So when you're evaluating a claim, it's not enough to look for evidence that supports it. you also need to look for evidence that challenges it. You need to see if there's evidence to refute it. Confirmation bias, which is the tendency to only seek out evidence that supports what we already believe, is one of the biggest enemies of truth. And it's something we all probably do to some degree, given that it tends to be an unconscious mechanism. That is, we don't tend to be aware that we're doing it. And so it's good to be aware of your own biases and to be willing to challenge your own beliefs. Real critical thinking means having the courage and willingness to explore opposing viewpoints and to see if your own beliefs hold up to scrutiny. It means having the willingness to consider that you might be wrong. Oftentimes, there are two sides to a story. Sometimes that's because you have two people looking at the same thing from opposite angles. And so they both might be seeing something that the other isn't. And other times, there's two sides to a story because one person is telling the truth and the other is lying. And so the trick is to tell the difference, to be able to identify when a disagreement is a matter of perspective or a matter of fact. And to do that, you need to look at the situation from every available angle in order to get a more rounded picture. This is why I recommend getting your information from multiple sources and making sure that those sources don't all share the same bias. It's also important to distinguish between facts and opinions, because a lot of what passes for news these days is highly opinionated and speculative. Facts are verifiable. Facts can be demonstrated, tested, and confirmed. Opinions, on the other hand, are merely feelings and judgments regarding those facts. Speculations and assumptions are guesses about what might be true in the absence of facts, and could just as well turn out to be false. The problem I often see is that many people take these sorts of opinions, speculations, and assumptions and treat them as if they're facts, because most people don't seem to understand the difference. And so critical thinking involves making that distinction. It involves asking the question, is this a fact or is this an assumption? Is this a fact or merely an opinion? And something to take particular notice of is how our own emotions can cloud our judgment and override our ability to think clearly and critically. When something causes us to feel angry or afraid, we're more likely to immediately believe it without question. And this is how misinformation gets spread so quickly. Someone hears something, they have an emotional reaction, and then they pass the information on. But what they don't do is pause long enough to find out if the information is true. So whenever you feel a strong emotional reaction to a piece of information, take a moment to pause. Take a moment to breathe. Allow the feeling to soften and settle. And consider the possibility that the information you're being presented with may not be as it appears. Oftentimes, information is intentionally misrepresented in order to elicit an emotional reaction, because that's what grabs attention. That's what gets clicks and shares. And sometimes it's about pushing a certain political narrative. Emotional manipulation is a powerful tool, often used to control public opinion. But being aware of this kind of manipulation makes you less susceptible to it. So when you hear a story that causes you to feel angry or afraid, instead of being consumed by that feeling, instead of impulsively reacting, take a step back and look a little deeper. See if there's more to the story than what's being presented. And sometimes that might mean being a bit patient and waiting for all the facts to come out, because sometimes the real story turns out to be very different than the one you initially hear. At its heart, critical thinking is ultimately about being curious. This means having a sincere desire to know what is true, not simply what is comforting or convenient. It means not settling for what's on the surface, but digging deeper, exploring, investigating, asking questions. It means looking beyond the headlines, beyond the sound bites and video clips. It means seeking to uncover all the layers of the story to get to the truth. All of us are born with this amazing intellect that can reason and analyze and make sense of the world. It's one of the most extraordinary things in existence. And yet, so many of us take it for granted. So many of us neglect it by outsourcing our thinking to others, by borrowing all of our beliefs and viewpoints and opinions from others instead of forming our own. Don't waste that gift. Use it. Exercise it. Because truth doesn't come from authority. It comes from understanding. And understanding only comes to those willing to seek it for themselves. So, be curious, be skeptical, be thoughtful, and above all, think for yourself. If you value this kind of content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can also support the channel by purchasing merch from our online store. The link is in the video description.